It was January 8, 1945, in the frozen forests near Houffalize, Belgium. The temperature had dropped to minus 12 degrees Celsius overnight, turning the morning fog into a thick, clinging mist that obscured everything beyond 200 yards. Oberleutnant Kurt Knispel sat inside his Panther Ausf G, watching the morning mist rise through his commander's cupola, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, despite the engine's warmth radiating through the crew compartment. The Panther's engine idled with a low, throaty rumble that Knispel had come to know intimately over 18 months of combat. Every vibration, every mechanical noise spoke to him of the machine's condition. This morning, the Maybach HL du Centre sounded healthy, its 12 cylinders turning smoothly despite the cold. Fuel was adequate, 3/4 of a tank. Ammunition racks were full, 79 rounds of 75mm. The crew had slept in shifts inside the tank, maintaining readiness through the night. For 18 months, he and his crew had operated with a confidence that bordered on mathematical certainty. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Their machine was immune to American firepower from the front. Every after-action report, every tactical brief, every scrap of intelligence confirmed it. The American 76mm gun, mounted on their up-gunned Shermans and Mendixsuite tank destroyers, lacked the velocity to threaten a Panther's glacis plate at combat range. The numbers had been drilled into them during training, reinforced by combat experience, validated by every engagement where American shells bounced harmlessly off their sloped armor. Knispel's crew knew these numbers by heart. The glacis plate, 80mm thick, angled at 55 degrees, had turned aside dozens of rounds over the months. The turret front, 100mm of hardened steel, was even more secure. They'd been hit before, many times, and walked away. The confidence this bred was more than psychological comfort. It was tactical reality that shaped every decision, every engagement, every moment of combat. In the next 4 minutes, that certainty would shatter. This is the story of how a single tungsten-cored round, fired from a weapon German intelligence had dismissed as inadequate, broke an assumption that had governed Panzer tactics for 2 years, and how that broken assumption, spreading like a virus through the Panzerwaffe, helped collapse German armoured resistance in the war's final months. Since the Panther first entered combat at Kursk in July 1943, its crews had inhabited a psychological fortress as impenetrable as their frontal armour. The numbers told a story of dominance that seemed to defy physics itself. The Panther's 80mm glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical, created an effective thickness of 140mm against a direct hit. German metallurgists had calculated this precisely, had tested it extensively at proving grounds across the Reich. The American 76mm Mun gun, firing its standard M60 Duzone armor-piercing capped round, could penetrate at best 92mm of armor at 800 yards. Wehrmacht technical intelligence had obtained complete specifications of the 76mm gun through captured examples in Normandy. They'd conducted exhaustive firing tests against armor plate. The data was irrefutable. At normal combat ranges, the American gun simply lacked the kinetic energy to drive a projectile through that much sloped hardened steel. The mathematics were brutal and simple. At normal combat range, between 500 and 1,000 yards, a Panther was invulnerable to American tank guns from the front. The Sherman crews knew it. The tank destroyer battalions knew it. Most importantly, the German crews knew it, and that knowledge shaped everything. It influenced how they positioned their vehicles, how they chose engagement, range, how they responded to threats. The frontal immunity wasn't just armor, it was doctrine. They developed tactics built on this immunity. Panthers would position themselves at range, often 1,500 to 2,000 yards from expected American approach routes. At that distance, their own 75mm Quacquart 42 L60 gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor with contemptuous ease. The gun had a muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second, significantly higher than the American 76mm, 2,600 feet per second. This velocity advantage translated to flat trajectory, excellent accuracy, and devastating terminal effects. While return fire from American 75mm or even 76mm guns would bounce off harmlessly or, at worst, scar the paint. The psychological security this provided was difficult to overstate. Panther crews operated knowing they could be hit repeatedly from the front without penetration. They'd seen it happen. Rounds striking the glacis and ricocheting skyward in showers of sparks. Rounds hitting the turret face and leaving nothing but scorch marks. The armor worked. It protected them. It made them gods of the battlefield. The confidence this bred was intoxicating. Veterans of Panther battalions described the sensation of watching American shells ricochet off their glacis plate in showers of sparks. The distinctive ping of inadequate rounds failing to penetrate, followed by the smooth response of their own gun turning an enemy tank into a funeral pyre. They painted kill rings on their gun barrels with white paint, each ring representing a confirmed kill. Some guns had 6 rings, 8, 10. Each mark a testament to their machine's brutal superiority. They developed a swagger in their movements, a certainty in their engagements. When American armor appeared, experienced Panther crews didn't feel fear. They felt anticipation. Another opportunity to demonstrate superiority, to add another kill to their tally, to survive another day through the protection of superior German engineering. The confidence extended beyond individual crews to entire battalions, shaping operational planning and strategic thinking. Intelligence reports reinforced this belief with mathematical precision. Wehrmacht analysis of captured American ordnance from July 1944 confirmed what battlefield experience suggested. The 76mm gun represented a marginal improvement over the 75mm, adequate against Panzerkortes at medium range, perhaps threatening to a Panther's turret face at close range if the Americans got lucky with shot placement, but fundamentally incapable of penetrating the hull front, where it mattered most. Technical documents captured from destroyed American vehicles included gunnery tables that showed the 76mm penetration capabilities at various range. The numbers confirmed German confidence. Against face-hardened armor at 30 degrees obliquity, representing roughly the Panther's glacis angle, the 76mm M62 round could penetrate perhaps 90 to 100mm at 500 yards. Against the Panther's effective thickness of 140mm, this was inadequate. Physics dictated the outcome. German after-action reports from Normandy through the autumn of 1944 showed a consistent pattern. Panthers engaged American armor at range, where they themselves were immune, destroyed multiple targets with clinical precision, withdrew when threatened with flanking maneuvers, or when supporting infantry made the position untenable. The American gun, in German eyes, remained a known quantity, understood, calibrated, safe. It could be dangerous if American numbers overwhelmed German positions, if flanking attacks succeeded, if air power forced withdrawal. But frontally, at combat ranges, the Panther was secure. Commanders incorporated this assumption into their tactical planning. A single Panther, properly positioned, could hold a road junction against multiple American vehicles. The mathematics of the engagement favored the defender so heavily that aggressive German tactics became standard. Advanced positions, limited withdrawal, acceptance of isolation, all viable because the armor would protect the crew long enough for reinforcement or extraction. But 3,000 miles away, in the laboratories and proving grounds of the United States, a different story was emerging. American ordnance officers, stung by reports from France of inadequate firepower against the newest German armor, had accelerated development of a round that would change the calculus entirely. They called it the throaty, later standardized as the M-Quate-Vingt-Trays, high-velocity armor piercing with a tungsten carbide core. The development program began in earnest after the Isigny tests in August 1944, when captured Panthers were subjected to comprehensive firing trials at a test range in Normandy. American engineers had obtained 3 intact Panthers, one captured near Caen, another from the Falaise pocket, a third abandoned during the German retreat across France. The vehicles were transported to a secure facility, and subjected to methodical analysis. What American engineers discovered was simultaneously encouraging and frustrating. The standard 76mm round, the M62 could penetrate a Panther's turret mantlet at close range, under 400 yards with good shot placement. The side armor was vulnerable at any practical range. The gun simply lacked the velocity to drive a full-caliber projectile through that much-sloped armor. Ballistic engineers calculated that defeating the Panther's glacis required approximately 3,900 feet per second impact velocity with a hardened penetrator. The standard M62 left the 76mm barrel at 2,600 feet per second. Even accounting for the relatively flat trajectory at combat ranges, the round simply didn't carry enough kinetic energy. Increasing barrel length to boost velocity would make the gun too heavy for medium tank turrets. Increasing propellant charge risked chamber pressure beyond safe limits. The solution was to sacrifice projectile weight for velocity, make the penetrator smaller, lighter, and encase it in a lightweight sabot that would fall away after leaving the barrel. The Maybach HL round weighed 15 pounds, compared to the 24-pound M62, but its tungsten carbide core, encased in a lighter aluminum jacket, left the gun at 3,400 feet per second, compared to 2,600 feet per second for the standard round. That 800 feet per second difference was revolutionary. The tungsten carbide core was the key innovation. Tungsten, with a density nearly twice that of steel, maintained its kinetic energy better during penetration. The carbide hardening process made it capable of shattering hardened steel armor without itself fragmenting. The aluminum jacket reduced barrel wear and provided aerodynamic stability during flight. The complete package was an engineering marvel, cramming maximum penetrative capability into a projectile that could be fired from existing guns. At 100 yards, firing at flat plate, the MK trays could penetrate 201 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. This was a staggering figure, exceeding even the 90mm gun's performance with standard ammunition. Against the Panther's sloped glacis, performance degraded significantly due to the tungsten core's tendency to ricochet off highly angled surfaces. German armor doctrine had specifically exploited this weakness of hard projectiles. But against the lower hull plate, which sat at a more modest angle, or against the turret mantlet, or against any side aspect, the tungsten core was devastatingly effective. The ICINE tests proved the concept. At range under 600 yards, the Maybach trees could reliably penetrate a Panther's lower hull. At 800 yards, penetration probability dropped to approximately 60%, still tactically useful. The turret mantlet was vulnerable at all practical ranges, though hitting the relatively small target required good shot placement. The results were forwarded to Washington with urgent priority. Production began in July 1944. The initial order was for 20,000 rounds, split between the 76mm gun and the 3-inch gun, which used the same projectile. Then production targets were raised to 43,000 per month through the end of the year, dropping to 10,000 monthly thereafter. The plan was ambitious, reflecting the urgency of providing American tank crews with adequate firepower against German heavy armor. But tungsten was a strategic material, in desperately high demand. Armor-piercing ammunition across all services required tungsten cores. Machine tools in factories needed tungsten carbide cutting edges. Armor plate itself used tungsten as an alloying element. Aircraft engine valves required tungsten for heat resistance. A dozen critical war production requirements competed for limited supplies. Tungsten came primarily from China and Portugal, both sources vulnerable to disruption. Domestic production couldn't meet demand. Production ramped up slowly. The first 1,000 rounds were shipped by air to Europe in August, arriving in time for the ICINE tests and immediate field trials with combat units. Priority went to Memdich's WIT tank destroyer battalions, whose mission specifically focused on defeating enemy armor. Memdich's units, equipped with 3-inch guns, received allocations next. Sherman battalions, still viewed primarily as infantry support, vehicles despite their upgunned variants, received fewer still. By the end of 1944, Only 18,000 HVAP rounds had reached the European theatre of operations across all calibers, with hundreds of 76mm guns and 3-inch guns in theatre that worked out to perhaps 2 rounds per tank, maybe 3 if you were in a priority unit, 5 if you were incredibly fortunate. Sherman battalions received even less, often just 1 or 2 rounds per vehicle for familiarization and emergency use. The scarcity created a profound paradox. American crews possessed a round that could, theoretically, defeat a Panther frontally at close to medium range. But they had so few that using them required near-perfect circumstances. Tank commanders hoarded their HVAP rounds like gold, carefully noting their location in the ammunition racks, instructing loaders never to load them without explicit orders, saving them for desperate moments when nothing else would work. Created a psychological burden. Crews knew they had the capability to defeat Panthers frontally, but only for 1 or 2 shots. After that, they reverted to inadequate standard ammunition and the old tactics of flanking, numerical superiority, and accepting casualties. The knowledge that salvation existed but remained out of reach, rationed by logistics rather than denied by physics, was frustrating in ways that complete inability was not. And German intelligence, for all its sophistication, and despite having one of the most effective intelligence services of the war, missed the development entirely. Wehrmacht analysis of American ammunition stocks through the autumn of 1944 made no mention of tungsten cord rounds. Reports from Panther crews who'd engaged American armor at close range described the same ineffective 76mm rounds they'd always seen. Standard APCBC ammunition that sparked off their glacis plates, leaving scorch marks but no penetrations. A few reports mentioned impacts that seemed to have more effect than expected. One crew near Aachen reported a 76mm hit on their turret mantlet that had caused significant spalling inside the turret, wounding the loader. Another crew near Metz described a round that penetrated their lower hull at close range, though they assumed it was a shot to a weak point or defective armor plate. These reports were noted but not synthesized into a pattern suggesting new ammunition types. The Germans couldn't conceive that American industry, already producing shells by the millions, managing multiple ammunition types across dozens of calibers, maintaining supply lines across an ocean, could also develop and field a specialized anti-armor round in quantities sufficient to matter. They'd fallen victim to their own propaganda, the belief that American production focused on quantity over quality, that Yankee engineering was inherently inferior to German craftsmanship, that American industry could make many things but not the best things. This was the same assumption that had led them to underestimate American industrial capacity throughout the war, the same assumption that said America couldn't build heavy bombers fast enough to matter until B-Dix Sepsagon darkened German skies in 1,000-plane raids. The same assumption that said American shipbuilding couldn't replace U-boat sinkings until Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines faster than submarines could sink them. The same assumption that proved catastrophically wrong at every turn, yet persisted because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. It was this blind spot, this failure of imagination, that made what happened in the forests of Belgium so psychologically devastating. The Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, initially caught American forces off balance. German armor, including numerous Panther battalions drawn from the Eastern Front, pushed deep into Allied lines. The surprise was complete. For a few days, it seemed like the German armor might reach their objectives. But by early January, the offensive had stalled. American resistance stiffened as reinforcements arrived from north and south. Supply lines, already tenuous, stretched beyond the breaking point. Fuel shortages left German vehicles immobile. Weather cleared enough for Allied air power to savage German columns with devastating effectiveness. The offensive, ambitious in concept, collapsed under its own logistical impossibilities. By January 8th, Kampfgruppe paper, equipped with Panthers and King Tigers, was in retreat near Houffalize. The unit had penetrated deepest into American lines but now found itself threatened with encirclement. They'd held a key road junction for 3 days, buying time for other units to withdraw, bleeding American forces with carefully managed defensive fighting. But American pressure from multiple directions made the position untenable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The plan was simple. Hold the junction until nightfall, then fall back under cover of darkness to new positions further east. Oberleutnant Knispel's Panther was positioned behind a destroyed farmhouse, with clear fields of fire down the main approach road. His crew had been together since Kursk, 18 months of combat that had forged them into an efficient, deadly team. Meyer, his gunner, could identify vehicle types at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The loader could maintain a sustained rate of fire exceeding 6 rounds per minute. The driver could navigate terrain in complete darkness, using only the sound of the engine and the feel of the vehicle's suspension. They knew their machine intimately, knew what it could survive. Over its service life: 3 rounds to the glacis plate, all ricochets; 2 rounds to the turret face, both failing to penetrate; 1 round to the side skirt armor, punching through the thin plate but stopped by the main hull armor beneath; 1 round to the engine deck from aircraft cannon fire, causing a fuel fire that the crew extinguished before it spread to the engine compartment. The vehicle had survived everything thrown at it. Around 900 hours, movement appeared on the road, American armor advancing cautiously through the morning mist. Through his optics, Knispel identified the lead vehicles: Maquatre Shermans, 3 of them, and behind them what looked like Medic Suite Hellcats, recognizable by their low, angular silhouettes and lack of a bow machine gun. The Americans were moving slowly, cautiously, clearly aware they were entering contested territory. The range was approximately 800 yards, measured by the ranging marks in Knispel's optics. Perfect engagement distance. At this range, the Panther's gun was devastatingly accurate, while American return fire was unlikely to penetrate, even if it hit. His gunner, Unteroffizier Hans Meyer, had the first Sherman in his sight, the crosshairs centered on the vehicle's upper hull, where the driver's position was located. The 75mm Quaquet 42 was already loaded with armor-piercing, as it always was for the first shot. Standard procedure. Engage at range, destroy the lead vehicle to block the road, pick off the others as they tried to maneuver around the wreck. This tactic had worked dozens of times before. American armor doctrine emphasized mobility and numbers. Blocking their avenue of approach forced them to deploy from column into line, presenting their vulnerable flanks, buying time for withdrawal, or allowing concentrated fire against piecemeal targets. Knispel gave the order. Meyer fired. The turret rocked back slightly from the recoil. Even the Panther's massive turret ring and hydraulic. The system couldn't completely absorb the force of the gun. The round crossed 800 yards in just over a second. A flat, laser-like trajectory that was one of the Quake Crane Do's signature characteristics. It struck the lead Sherman on the frontal hull, slightly left of center where the armor was thickest but still inadequate against the Panther's gun. Penetration was immediate and catastrophic. The round punched clean through the Sherman's frontal plate, traversed the crew compartment, and ignited ammunition stored in the sponson. The tank erupted in flame and smoke, the turret lifting visibly from the hull ring before settling back at an angle. The crew bailed out immediately through whatever hatches they could reach. 1 man emerged from the turret, his clothes on fire, rolling on the frozen ground. Another emerged from the driver's hatch, helping a 3rd crewman who appeared wounded. 1 down, 4 survivors, standard outcome for a frontal penetration on a Sherman. The 2 remaining. Shermans reversed rapidly, their drivers reacting with trained precision to the lead vehicle's destruction. They disappeared behind a tree line within seconds, using terrain to break line of sight. The Hellcats, faster and more cautious by doctrine, had already pulled back at the sound of the first shot. They hadn't committed to the advance, hanging back perhaps 400 yards behind the Shermans, which probably saved them. This was the pattern Knispel expected. The Americans would regroup, call in artillery, maybe try to flank using the forest trails his own reconnaissance had already identified and reported. His Panther would relocate before they could coordinate a response, moving to an alternate position prepared the night before. They'd held the junction another hour at least, probably longer if the Americans were cautious. Standard engagement. Standard outcome. The certainty was comforting. He ordered his driver to back the Panther deeper into the farmhouse ruins, repositioning for a better angle if the Americans tried to circle around from the north. The Maybach engine responded smoothly, the vehicle reversing 30 yards before the driver angled it to provide hull-down protection behind a collapsed wall. From this position, only the turret would be visible to anyone approaching from the road, reducing the target profile significantly. 3 minutes passed. Meyer kept his eye to the gun sight, scanning the tree line where the Shermans had disappeared. The loader, Gefreiter Otto Klein, kept one hand on the next round, ready to load as soon as the breach opened. The radio operator monitored battalion frequency, listening for updates from other positions along the defensive line. Everything was routine. Everything was controlled. Then, through the tree line approximately 700 yards distant, one of the Hellcats emerged. It was moving fast, taking advantage of the MDiXWIT's superior speed and agility. The vehicle was angling for a shot, position, trying to get hull down behind a low rise where only its turret would be exposed. From there, it could fire and maneuver while presenting a smaller target. Knispel recognized the tactic. American tank destroyer doctrine emphasized speed and positioning over armor protection. But the Hellcat had to cross 30 yards of open ground to reach that position, 30 yards where it would be completely exposed. Meyer tracked it smoothly through his sight, the hydraulic turret traverse keeping pace with the target's movement. His hand rested on the firing trigger, waiting for Knispel's order. The American vehicle was fast. Its speed was its only real protection, but not fast enough to cross open ground before a trained gunner could fire. Knispel let it commit to the crossing, watching the Hellcat accelerate across the frozen field. Let it reach the point where it couldn't reverse course quickly, without exposing its thin rear armor. The MDiXWIT was vulnerable everywhere. Its thin armor, designed to save weight for speed, meant penetration was almost guaranteed from any angle, at any range with the Panther's gun. Then he gave the order, a single word that Meyer had heard hundreds of times. Feuer. Meyer fired. The round struck the Hellcat's hull just below the turret ring, exactly where Meyer had aimed. But the impact didn't have the catastrophic effect they'd expected. The MDiXWIT's thin armor, 15 millimeters at most on the hull, meant the round should have over-penetrated, passing completely through and creating massive internal damage. Instead, the vehicle shuddered from the impact. Smoke poured from hatches, but it kept moving, completing its dash to the hull-down position. Wounded, perhaps, crew casualties likely, but not dead. The vehicle's turret was still moving, traversing to engage, which meant at least the gunner and commander were functional. This concerned Knispel. A damaged but operational enemy tank destroyer was still dangerous. The MDiXWIT mounted the same 76mm gun as the up-gunned Shermans. At 700 yards, according to every intelligence report, every after-action analysis, every tactical manual, it couldn't hurt his Panther frontally. But if it had communication with the other American vehicles, it could direct flanking attempts. It could call in artillery. It could observe and report German positions. Better to destroy it completely, eliminate the threat, than let it survive to coordinate American responses. Meyer reloaded. The loader moved with practiced efficiency, opening the breech, extracting the spent casing, loading a fresh round, closing the breech. 6 seconds. The Hellcat's turret was visible above the rise, turning to engage. Knispel calculated rapidly. Every engagement they'd had over 18 months confirmed this. So they were either looking for a side shot, trying to spot for other vehicles, or attempting to suppress his position, while other units maneuvered. He decided to destroy the Hellcat before it could coordinate anything, to eliminate even the possibility of effective American response. But before Meyer could fire again, the Hellcat's gun flashed. At 700 yards, Knispel had perhaps 1 second to register that the American crew was actually engaging his Panther head-on, directly, a tactically pointless gesture, given the 76mm known limitations against Panther frontal armor. It was suicidal desperation or catastrophic tactical error. Then the round arrived. The impact was different from anything Knispel had experienced in 18 months of combat. Not the ping of a deflected round glancing off sloped armor. Not the dull thud of an inadequate shell failing against superior thickness. This was a sharp, violent crack, accompanied by a brilliant flash of light inside the turret, and a shower of metal fragments that filled the crew compartment with deadly shrapnel. The Panther's turret hydraulics screamed and seized, pressure dropping instantly as fluid sprayed from ruptured lines. The periscope in front of Knispel's face shattered, glass fragments cutting his forehead, and something hot, moving with terrible velocity, tore through his left shoulder, spinning him against the turret wall with force that drove the breath from his lungs. The pain came a second later, sharp and overwhelming. For 3 seconds, there was chaos. Smoke filled the turret from burning hydraulic fluid. Meyer was screaming, clutching his face where fragments had struck him. The loader was shouting something about penetration, his voice high with panic. The radio operator was yelling into the intercom, demanding to know what happened. And Knispel, his ears ringing, his shoulder on fire, his vision swimming, tried to process what had just happened. They'd been hit, frontally, at 700 yards, by a 76mm gun, which, according to every piece of intelligence, every tactical manual, every combat report, every test result, was impossible. The mathematics didn't support it. The ballistics didn't allow it. The armor should have stopped it. But the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, terrifying. A fist-sized hole had been punched through the turret mantlet, exactly where the American round had struck. The mantlet was the turret's thickest point, 100mm of hardened steel, and something had driven straight through it. The round had penetrated, sending tungsten fragments and spalling through the turret interior with devastating effect. Meyer had taken fragments to his face and right arm, blood streaming from multiple lacerations. The gun's elevation mechanism was shattered, hydraulic fluid spraying across the breach. The turret could still traverse, but only manually, and couldn't elevate the gun properly. The loader, Klein, miraculously unhurt despite standing next to the penetration point, was staring at the hole with an expression that combined disbelief, terror, and dawning realization. The interior surface around the penetration showed characteristic cratering where armor had failed, metal pushed inward and backward by forces that shouldn't have been possible from a 76mm gun at this range. Damage assessment. The turret could still traverse manually, but couldn't elevate the gun properly, making accurate fire impossible. Communications were intact. The radio operator still had contact with battalion. The engine was running normally, no indication of damage to the hull or running gear. They weren't burning, which meant no fuel fire, no ammunition cook-off. Yet. But they were combat ineffective. The gun couldn't be aimed properly. The crew was wounded, and if that American vehicle fired again, the next round might penetrate the thinner turret side, or find the ammunition stowage, or strike a critical component. The protection they'd relied on for 18 months had failed. The armor hadn't saved them. The immunity was gone. He gave the order to withdraw, his voice rough with pain but clear. The driver, who'd felt the massive impact but couldn't see the damage from his position forward in the hull, didn't question it. He knew from experience that if the commander ordered withdrawal, there was good reason. The Panther reversed out of the farmhouse ruins, using the building as cover, then turned and accelerated toward the fallback position, leaving the junction exposed to American advance. As they retreated, Knispel looked back through the commander's cupola, his remaining good eye watering from pain and shock. The Hellcat was still there, hull down, watching them go. It didn't fire again. It didn't need to. The message had been delivered with brutal clarity. The Americans had a round that could penetrate. Panther frontal armor. The calculations were wrong. The assumptions were wrong. Everything was wrong. At the field aid station, 4 miles behind the lines, a medic worked on Knispel's shoulder, while he dictated his after-action report to a young lieutenant who'd been assigned casualty documentation duty. The medic extracted 7 fragments, some small as grains of rice, others large as thumbnails. One had passed completely through the shoulder muscle, missing bone and major blood vessels by centimeters. Another had lodged against the scapula. Impact location on his Panther, angle of impact, sound of impact, visual characteristics of the penetration, internal damage, crew casualties. He noted that the American round had behaved unlike any previous 76mm ammunition he'd encountered. Higher velocity, based on the flatter trajectory, and the sharp crack of impact rather than the duller sound of standard rounds. The T-0E-6 round for the 90mm gun, designed for the MVinct 6 Pershing and Mountrent 6 tank destroyer, could defeat King Tiger frontal armor at combat range. American ballistic engineers were developing discarding saber designs that would push velocities even higher. Shaped charge ammunition was being refined for use against the heaviest armor. The American industrial and technical response to the Panther threat was accelerating, not slowing. American industry, having finally focused on quality to match its legendary quantity, was accelerating past what German factories could hope to achieve. The production capacity that had seemed like a weakness in 1941, an emphasis on numbers over excellence, proved to be the foundation for rapid innovation. When American engineers identified a problem, the industrial base could pivot to solve it at scale. When battlefield reports to identified a deficiency, production lines could adapt within months rather than years. The contrast between American and German industrial philosophy became starkly, brutally evident in early 1945. Germany had designed the Panther to be a technological masterpiece, a tank superior to anything the Allies could field, incorporating lessons from the Trent-Carter encounter on the Eastern Front. But they'd built it in relatively small numbers, around 6,000 total by war's end, and couldn't replace combat losses once production facilities were bombed. America had built the Sherman to be adequate, reliable, and mass-producible, accepting lower performance in exchange for overwhelming numbers and logistical simplicity. When the Sherman proved inadequate against heavier German armor in Normandy, American industry simply developed better ammunition, designed better tanks, improved existing designs, while maintaining Sherman production at levels that ensured numerical superiority, regardless of loss rates. The 76mm Mun gun, mounted on upgunned Shermans and MDIC-Suite Hellcat tank destroyers, fired over 130,000 HVAP rounds during the war's final months. Each round represented a calculated engineering response to a specific battlefield problem. Lightweight design for high velocity, tungsten carbide for maximum penetration, aluminum jacket to reduce barrel wear and provide stability. The rounds cost significantly more than standard ammunition, approximately $20 compared to $3 for standard rounds. But American industry simply scaled production to meet demand. German tungsten supplies, by contrast, had been effectively exhausted by late 1944. Their own APCR ammunition, which used tungsten cores for enhanced penetration similar to the American design, had become so scarce that commanders received explicit written orders to conserve it for critical targets only. Panthers and Tigers carried maybe 1 or 2 tungsten rounds per gun, held in reserve for encounters with heavy Allied armor or critical defensive situations. When those precious rounds were expended, crews reverted to standard ammunition with its lower penetration values, accepting reduced effectiveness rather than wasting strategic materials. This disparity in special ammunition availability created a vicious feedback loop. American crews could experiment with HVAP rounds, could practice with them on training ranges, could learn their characteristics and limitations through actual employment, developing the tactical familiarity that breeds confidence and skill. German crews hoarded their few tungsten rounds like misers, using them only in desperate circumstances, never developing the practical experience that turns theoretical capability into battlefield effectiveness. The Americans grew more aggressive as they learned what their weapons could actually do. The Germans grew more cautious, rationing their best ammunition, never certain when they might face a threat that absolutely required it, always wondering if they'd wasted a precious round on a target that standard ammunition might have defeated. By April 1945, the collapse was total and irreversible. American forces were advancing at rates that seemed impossible, 50 to 60 miles per day in some sectors. German armor units, starved of fuel and ammunition, were surrendering en masse or being destroyed piecemeal as they tried to establish defensive lines that collapsed before they could be properly organized. Panthers, those fearsome machines that had dominated battlefields from Kursk to Normandy, were being found abandoned by the roadside in shocking numbers. Intact vehicles with fuel tanks empty, operational tanks with broken tracks and no repair crews. Combat-capable vehicles simply left behind as crews deserted or were captured. The mechanical complexity that had made the Panther formidable when properly maintained became a fatal weakness when support infrastructure collapsed. In the final weeks of the war, American tank commanders reported that German armor often withdrew at the first sign of contact, unwilling to risk engagement even when tactical positions strongly favored them. The aggressive confidence that had characterized panzer operations through Barbarossa, through North Africa, through the early stages of Normandy, had evaporated entirely, replaced by a defensive mentality focused solely on survival. One American tank battalion commander, writing in his personal journal after the war ended, captured the transformation with brutal succinctness. In Normandy, we feared the Panthers genuinely and rationally. They had better guns with higher velocity. They had better armor with superior protection. They had better positioning with longer engagement ranges. March 1945, just 9 months later, the same German crews in the same German tanks were retreating from fights they could have won, or should have at least contested. The tanks hadn't fundamentally changed. The guns hadn't changed. The armor was the same. But something in the men had broken irreparably. They no longer believed their armor would save them. And once that belief died, the will to fight died with it. We didn't defeat the Panther. We defeated the myth of the Panther, and that was enough. The 76mm H-Vape round, in purely material terms, was a modest technical achievement. It gave American tank destroyers and upgunned Shermans the ability to defeat Panther frontal armor at close to medium range, typically under 800 yards, conditions that already favored aggressive American tactics, emphasizing mobility and combined arms coordination. It didn't revolutionize armored warfare. It didn't win battles single-handedly. Its actual tactical impact was constrained by limited supply, specific employment requirements, and the continued effectiveness of German armor when properly employed. But its psychological impact was absolutely devastating. It shattered the myth of Panther invulnerability at exactly the moment when that myth was the last thing holding German armored forces together psychologically. It proved to Panzer crews that American industry could not only match German quality, but could exceed it when properly motivated and resourced. It demonstrated that the assumptions they'd built entire tactical doctrines around, the calculations they'd trusted their lives to for 2 years, could be invalidated by an enemy who'd refused to accept inferiority as permanent. His shoulder wound kept him from frontline combat through February, and by the time he'd healed enough to return to active duty, his battalion had been destroyed in the desperate fighting east of Berlin. He surrendered to American forces on April 25, 1945, choosing captivity over dying for a cause he no longer believed in. In post-war interviews conducted by Allied intelligence officers gathering information on German armor tactics, he was asked extensively about his combat experiences, about the battles he'd fought across multiple theaters, about the famous German tanks he'd commanded with distinction. But when asked specifically what single moment convinced him Germany would ultimately lose the war, he didn't mention the Normandy invasion, or the collapse of the Ardennes offensive, or the crossing of the Rhine. He mentioned January 8th, in the frozen forests of Belgium, when a 76mm round punched through his Panther's turret mantlet from 700 yards away. "That's when I knew with absolute certainty," he stated. Not because the Americans had developed a better weapon, though they had, but because they'd done what we couldn't, anymore. They'd identified a problem, engineered an effective solution, and deployed it at industrial scale in the middle of a war. That kind of capacity, that industrial and intellectual flexibility, doesn't lose wars. It wins them. The tungsten cored round that defeated his Panther weighed 15 pounds and cost approximately $20 to manufacture. For that modest investment, American industry had purchased something far more valuable than simple armor penetration capability. They'd purchased doubt. They'd purchased hesitation. They'd purchased the creeping certainty in every Panther crew's mind that their machine, their protection, their technological advantage was no longer sufficient to guarantee survival. And once that certainty took root in the collective consciousness of the Panther Ausf, no amount of armor thickness could protect against it. The psychological fortress that Panther crews had inhabited since Kursk, built on the seemingly unshakable foundation of technological superiority and frontal immunity, collapsed as completely as if it had been hit by a 90mm round. The hunters became the hunted, the predators became prey, and the myth of the invincible Panther died, not in some apocalyptic final battle for propaganda cameras, but in 100 small engagements where American tungsten found German steel and proved the calculations wrong. The Americans never imagined their 76mm gun could threaten a Panther frontally at combat range when it was first deployed. German intelligence never imagined the Americans would develop ammunition to make it possible. And German tankers never imagined they would spend the war's final desperate months looking at every approaching Sherman and wondering, with growing dread, if this was the one carrying the rounds that could kill them. That failure of imagination, on all sides, decided more battles than any gun, any armor, any tactical manual could. Because in war, as in everything else, the most dangerous enemy is the one you've stopped taking seriously. The Americans learned that lesson in Normandy when they first faced Panthers in numbers and discovered their 75mm guns were completely inadequate. They responded with better ammunition, better guns, better tanks, better tactics. They learned the lesson and adapted with characteristic American pragmatism. The Germans learned it too late. By the time they fully acknowledged that American firepower had evolved to genuinely threaten their best armor, the industrial capacity to respond effectively was gone. The factories were rubble under Allied bombs. The supply lines were severed by advancing armies. The strategic materials were exhausted by 4 years of war. All they had left was the armor they'd already built, and the men still willing to crew it. And both were melting away with each passing day, each penetrating round, each engagement where confidence died a little more. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.